This is Jessica.
And this is Kelly. And this is the Chasing Brighter
podcast. Hi, everybody. Welcome to October's Book Club. We are highlighting the work of Angie Thomas. We have selected her debut novel, The Hate U Give, which is a New York Times #1 bestseller. Angie Thomas has received the Coretta Scott King Award honor, the William C. Morris Award, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Boston Globe Horn Book Award. She was on the long list for the National Book Award and was a Best Young Adult nominee for the Edgar Allan Poe Award. This was her first novel, and now she has written 5 books. So join us in exploring The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. Hi, Kelly. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Jess. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk about this book. We want to describe the book. And then also, I think kind of just a note that this book is so heavy with so many themes, so much you can pull from it. And so we're going to pull kind of our favorites and what we took from it. But this isn't, by no means a comprehensive summary of the book. Would you agree, Cal?
I do. I think the other thing to note is, what we're going to touch on is the story and what the themes of the book. This is a young adult book, and it reads like a young adult book. There's not a lot of complexities to the story. The writing is young adult level. So, some of the reviews I read were like criticizing the writing, and it's like, this is a young adult book. It's not supposed to be too like looking too far into things or any sort of, complex literary situations.
But I thought that the characters were well developed. I loved them. I went ahead and I watched the movie. The book is always better. Of course, I was disappointed in the movie because they didn't have all of the characters. They didn't go as deep as a book does. So I loved the character development in this book.
I love the story. And I think, really, even though it is a fictional book, it reads so real, and it really put you into what truly felt like a day in the life of Star and her friends and family.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons we chose this book during our month of focus on social justice is that it's important for us to explore the views of victims of racism, right? It's essential to listen to the voices of all people. It's important for us to follow media that represents all people because representation in media matters. And so we want to learn about people, groups, experiences that are different than our own. And so that is one of the reasons why we chose this book. So just to summarize the book, the main character is 16-year-old Star Carter. She moves between 2 worlds, the poor neighborhood where she lives and the fancy suburban prep school she attends. The uneasy balance between these 2 worlds is shattered when Star witnesses the fatal shooting of her childhood best friend, Khalil, at the hands of a police officer. Khalil was unarmed. What everyone wants to know is what really went down that night. And the only person alive who can answer that is Star. I think it's important that although this is a work of fiction, it parallels so many stories of police brutality and violence. And to note that according to a study reported on by the Los Angeles Times, police violence was one of the leading causes of death for Black men in the years of 2013 to 2018. And this book really examines the way society uses stereotypes of Black people to justify violence and racism against them.
Yeah. I feel like the book also kind of transcends time. Like I could have read this book when I was in high school. Your kid can read this book now that she's in high school, and it still feels the same. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like the situations haven't changed. The family dynamics haven't changed. All the components of it. And I feel like that's a really important part of this book in some way. But I agree.
I think two different, right? I mean, if I'm two different, right? The themes of family and interactions is what you're talking about, but then also how not much has changed in the way of racism.
Not much has changed. No,
I would say this book could be almost set in the 60s.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Nothing has really changed in those ways.
Yes.
Yeah. I think about throughout the book, Star talks about the different versions of herself. She's one person in Garden Heights, the neighborhood that she's born and raised in, and a different person at her school, Williamson Prep, which is a predominantly white school, right? And, have you ever felt that, right? Like, have you ever felt, some people call it code switching, when you feel you must speak and act one way in one situation, speak and act another way in another situation? Is that something you can relate to?
Yeah, but I think it's just such to a different degree. I think as we get older, we learn to adapt to different social settings. But I mean, when I was, coming out of high school, going to college, and, coming out of being the country bumpkin from Kansas and going to moving far away and going to school at Notre Dame, where there was, a lot of kids who, definitely who grew up with were a lot more fortunate than I was. And it definitely opened my eyes up to, a different class of people.
Well, I think too, I was made fun of for the way I talked. Like we called it pop instead of soda, or I called it I did call it a washing machine.
Yeah, I called it wash
a
your
drawer,
hands.
like the drawer. I don't know. I was made fun of for the way I talked a lot. I know Star talks a lot about like her fear at Williamson Prep of being called ghetto. Like that she had to work so hard and watch the way she spoke because she did not want to be called ghetto. She didn't want to be like what a stereotypical, what people create a stereotype of what a Black woman would be like. And, do you think she switches successfully between the two places?
Well, she does until she kind of loses her cool at one point. And, I think even though that she showed her true self in that moment, I think it also brought to light maybe for her what's more important to her, which is like her roots versus even trying to fit in at school, right? Like in some ways maybe throughout life, we're all trying to fit in and to find a place of belonging, right? And so her sense of belonging in that school was trying to sort of blend in with everyone else. Which obviously was more work than just being her true self.
And she kept her Jordans, right? So she stayed a little bit true to herself. But I think there is a duality in cultures that many people live, right? Like you live one way at home. Like let's say you speak one language at home and you speak English outside the home, right? A lot of people, I think, experience that. And I think for her, she was both. I don't think she was one or the other. And I think that she began to accept that at the end. I mean, would you say like, right, you are getting a top-notch education and you are smart and you do like some of the advantages you have at Williamson Prep, but you also have this neighborhood you grew up in, this culture that you're living in, that's part of you as well. And so I think that her journey was to kind of marry those as well a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think, toward the end when they do kind of close the chapter a bit on even living in the neighborhood they grew up in and relocating, right? And changing to like a safer neighborhood.
I thought about that so much. So in the book, Star's family lives in Garden Heights and her father runs a store. Her mother is a nurse. Her uncle is a police officer and they live in a rich neighborhood. And her uncle wants them to leave Garden Heights, but her dad wants to stay in the community and help make change from within. And the parents fight throughout the book. Do we stay or do we go? Do we stay or do we go? And ultimately they decided to go. I think that's such a great I don't know, such a great question. Like, do you stay and try to make change? Or do you leave and still try to make change outside of the community?
Yeah, and I think what the dad came to terms with was even though they did physically move, he was keeping his store there, right? So he still was part of the community, even though they didn't physically live there. So he still felt like he was supporting the community, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Spoiler alert, if you watch the movie, they decide to stay. And I
Really?
was pissed. Yes, because to me, that was a huge theme in the book. Do we stay? Do we go? Do we stay? Do we go? Do we go? The dad taught the kids about the Black Panther movement and the Black Panther beliefs and raised them with knowing all of those values and beliefs. And so it's not like he was just like messing around. It was like he believed so deeply to his core to help his people and to try to make change and to be an upstanding citizen. But when, right, everyone around you is being shot and killed and your lives are being threatened, he could no longer choose to stay. I don't know. I just thought that was a big deal, and that they just changed it in the movie annoyed me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that would annoy me. It's, once you decide to make a leap, like if the sequel, there's not a sequel, it's actually a prequel. Did you know that? The Concrete Rose is that it's a story of the dad.
So Concrete Rose follows.
It
the sequel
precedes.
Oh, Concrete
it's
Rose.
The book. There's a new book coming out from, from Angie Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called Concrete Rose. And I don't know the Audible book, did you listen? Because at the end of the Audible, it's an excerpt from the Concrete Rose.
There were a lot of themes. If you wanted to pull themes, like I can imagine reading this book in college and a professor being, what's a theme? And the father's rose garden was a huge theme. And so I could see how that would be a follow-up book.
That's so deep, Jess.
I did not create that. I read that. I did not pull that from the book.
I just love this story because you listen, you learn about, even though it's fictional, about, an African-American family trying to survive. Their parents want the best for their kids. The parents are trying to, continue to create opportunities for themselves. The mom interviews for a job and she got a promotion in the book. They're sending their kids to private schools or better schools because they want their kids to have a better life. And all of those themes are such a lovely thing. And I feel like when you see a person walking down the street, nobody knows their story. And I think this book also, to me, when I see like a Black kid walking down the street, you don't know their lives. And I feel like that's where the police brutality thing really is, a struggle for me, because there's so much judgment and prejudice that are involved.
Like in this book, they killed a child. He was 16 years old doing nothing, and they killed a child, right? And it's like when people are like, oh, he was this, he was that, he was this, he was a 16-year-old child, right? And I think too, I want to go back a little bit when you say about the family moving. I think people think that, oh, you live in a bad neighborhood, then move. It's a very complicated system. I mean, we talked to Sarah, when you look at institutional racism, right? And there's redlining and there's racism, there's, looking at credit scores, credit checks, all of these things.
Yes.
And also not just that. So this family was very fortunate because they did have some social capital because the uncle married like a surgeon.
Yes.
And was like super wealthy.
True. Yes.
And, but it's so complicated. They have, family there, friends there, all of those people there. And then then everyone flees. Will there be change that will be made if everybody leaves? I think about that now. The face of my neighborhood has changed. Sometimes I'm like, screw it. I want out of it. Right. And then I'm like, no, I love my neighborhood. I love where I live. I want to stay here. And it's something I grapple with. For me, it's not because of violence and crime, but it's just a different vibe, that we have to to kind of look at. And so I think it, like you're saying, it helps you when you want to make a judgment of someone, like, why don't you just leave? Well, it's incredibly complicated issue. And so that's why I know you and I love reading and we love books, because it helps you learn more, you become more open-minded, and you develop empathy. And if we kind of get into that a little bit,
yes,
about the violence, right? And so once the jury's decision about Khalil is made public, unrest in Garden Heights begins. Sirens wail outside. The news shows 3 patrol cars that have been set ablaze at the police precinct. A gas station near the freeway gets looted. The neighborhood becomes a war zone. There's a long history of this happening, from the Watts protests in the 1960s to the protests after the Rodney King verdict in 1992 to protests after the death of Mike Brown in 2015 in Ferguson, starting with the Black Lives Matters campaign. Why does, in the book, the neighborhood react this way? And what is Star's reaction? I mean, I would say she tried to act like it wasn't happening and not do anything. And then what was the quote that you loved about the right thing?
Well, that was, sometimes you can do everything right and things will still go wrong. The key is to never stop doing right.
Yeah. So it's like she testified, she stood up, she spoke out, she went through all the correct means, and they still, like, nothing happened to the police officer that shot Khalil. And so I think she tried those ways. And toward the end, she got completely fed up. And I think then really understood why people get angry and why people loot and riot. It's like out of desperation, right? Like
wanting to be
legal
heard.
means are not, you're ignored, and the legal means are not working. You're trying to do it the right way.
Yeah. And I mean, even in the story, it just felt so close to home for me, because having lived through the Black Lives Matter movement in Chicago during the summer of 2020, when, there was a lot of, just unrest with a lot of different things, but there was a lot of activism about, police brutality. I see that scene happening here. It starts with the protest. It starts with, really promoting activism and trying to get your voice out. And it escalates from there. And sometimes it isn't the best, right? Sometimes it doesn't go as planned. I think it's interesting, like you're saying, I mean, from Star's point of view, that's where I think the writing is so real. She starts kind of like watching from afar, right? The scene of her during the protest, right? And then she gets dragged up onto the bus, right? Where she's talking to her attorney. I forget what the attorney's name was. And she then starts speaking, right? And she starts sharing her truth. And I feel like at that moment, she feels very liberated. And it was just cool. I think the way that part of the story was being told was just really neat, because here we talk a lot about teaching our kids activism. Here's a young adult book that puts you in the sight and sounds of a moment where a girl finds her voice to stick up for herself and to fight for what's right in a true activist way. And I thought that was really neat, because I've never been to a protest. I've never spoken like that. And you feel how she feels so much more energized and empowered in that moment, which was really awesome.
Yeah. And I think that follows up, like when she loses her friend, she's surprised by her response, because she always said that if I saw it happen to somebody, I would have the loudest voice, making sure the world knew what went down. And now I'm that person and I'm too afraid to speak. So it's like looking at us. How have you and I responded to police shootings of Black people? How do we imagine that we would respond if we were an eyewitness like Star? Because it's like we can say, oh, I would do this and I would do that. What are we doing now?
Yeah, I was surprised in the book about that, right? About how it was intentional because of the story to, like, her voice never got a credence in the justice system, right? With the police, she shared her story. It didn't matter. In the beginning of the book, I thought she would finally find the courage to speak out and things would get better. And the moral of the story is, it doesn't change.
Racism,
So,
right? Things are put in
yes.
place to oppress a group of people. I think like for me, for Black Lives Matters, I'm afraid. I have been afraid to go to an actual protest. And so I use my voice and social media and sharing and spreading words. And then I donate money to like the Black Lives Matter campaign. I am not out marching. I have been out marching before. I have been to protests before. And it is, I do grapple with that myself. Like, how do I become an activist in this? When I was younger, I really was out marching and protesting, but now I'm a mom. And I feel like so much of these turn violent and crazy. Like when the guy like drove his car in to the marches, right? So it's like
in Charlottesville,
you're not being a rioter. You get a permit and you're marching, and then a person drives over. You know what I mean?
It's like the other people who take advantage.
And it's like but all of these marches and protests are bringing attention to it, right? It's bringing attention to it to make change and to get people to notice and to recognize it and put a face to it. And so I would like to be like Star. I want to think that I would speak up. I want to think that I would volunteer as an eyewitness. But ultimately, I don't know what I would do coming into that,
Yeah.
And I think, why is this book, The Hate You Give with a U, the letter U, right? And it gets to thug life. And, the musician and rapper Tupac said that thug life stood for the hate you give little infants fucks everybody, meaning what society gives you as youth, it bites them in the ass later, right? Quote from the book. What is your reaction to this belief of the hate you give little infants fucks everybody? What do you think of that acronym? So I think about it, like, to give you a minute to think about it, like Khalil, right? He did nothing. He was not a thug. He was not in a gang. But everybody created this person that they wanted him to be. So the hate that they are giving him as a young Black man to say, oh, you were shot. Clearly you sell drugs. Clearly you're a gangbanger. Then,
screws everybody.
Yeah. Right. Like who benefits from that? No one benefited from that.
Yeah. I think that it's so sad to think about the fact that because of racism in general and injustice, that it's impacting an entire population of people.
So it's like our interview with Dawn, who works in an area that's over policed, right? So if your area is over policed, you're going to have more arrests, right? I worked in North Philadelphia with the Puerto Rican community. They were over policed. I had a client, I didn't know what happened to him. He missed a session. I was like, what happened to him? I talked to the case manager. We're trying to find him. He was like 15. Had been shot. He was like, oh, I was shot. Like then another friend, oh, you're going through their history, you're interviewing them. Tell me about your life. Oh, well, when I was 11, my best friend was shot in front of me. Just terrible, just so terrible. In, living in a neighborhood that is over policed, right? And so then it's like a cycle, right? It's cyclical. Then there's going to be more police violence and more police brutality, and then there's going to be more deaths, and then it's just devastating. And this book highlights that,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you think about Khalil, right? So it was living on the edge of poverty, right? They had no means of financially making ends meet.
Grandma got sick and lost her job.
Yeah. And they had no food, and he had to earn an income, right? He had to bring in money somehow. And so
but that's not why he was selling, right? It was a debt to the mom. Even then he still wasn't selling drugs, but what a pull to sell drugs.
That's true.
And then who brings
her
the drugs
addiction?
Who brings the drugs into the neighborhood? Do you think it's someone that lives in the neighborhood?
Right. No.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, there's like no way out of it. And
You're,
then
yeah. Yeah. I mean, then you get
you can
involved.
understand why people would sell drugs. It's
Yes.
fast
Well,
money.
you have no other choice. If you have limited options to,
There are no businesses in the neighborhood because banks aren't going to finance it. Going back again, redlining, all of the things of more ways to keep their community down. But I think not just about police brutality, but like you and I have talked about the commonalities in this book, understanding the common human experience, looking at, I thought family was such a big theme in this book. So Star's family was somewhat complicated. She lived with her parents and she had two brothers. One was older who had the same father, and one was younger who had the same mother and father. But her brother, sister was in her life. Her detective uncle didn't live there. So her brother was conceived when the parents were still like kind of together, not together. And the mom said, people make mistakes and you have to decide if their mistakes are bigger than your love for them. I loved that. I loved that about, I think her mom kind of resembled forgiveness.
Yeah.
And unconditional love. How do you think Star defined family?
I think, how do I think she defined it? I mean, it was her parents and her brothers and her, like you're saying, all of her relatives were all family. And she seemed to have, especially just because she had a lot of brothers, being the girl, she seemed to have, a lot of people rooting for her and a lot of people protecting her, right? She had her brothers looking out for her. She had her uncle looking out for her best interests, her dad, her mom, just the dynamic that she had with her parents. There was a support system there, right? All of them had a really strong support system, which helped them, have a safe place. They felt safe with their family, especially I can't imagine the struggles of having to go like living in Garden Heights and then going to a prep school, right? And just the dichotomy between those two worlds and having her parents there to support her.
And also, I think she defined family as more than just blood. Khalil's grandmother helped babysit her and raise her, and Khalil was her best friend. And then her half brother's sister, I think she considered family. Again, and I think about that too, right? We have the family that we're born with, and then we have our family of choice. And I think that they also created a family within their community. I think that's kind of how she defined family. I think I'm the same way. Like, Kelly, do you have people outside of blood relation that you consider family?
Absolutely.
Are there other themes, quotes you want to explore?
The other thing that we talked about, just other little analogies was, Star's dad, Maverick, had spent time in jail. And I think a lot of his even focus about his kids was he wanted a better life for them than he had. He knew, what I thought was awesome is even though he had, done whatever he did or got involved with whatever.
His dad was like the head of the gang, and then he became pretty high up in a gang.
And I think what was interesting about that too is how the dad was able to kind of get out of the gang in some way. He had a different dynamic. I thought that was interesting how the story talked through that because I know it's very difficult to kind of get out of quote unquote that life. So he had some leverage there, which isn't easy for everybody. But anyway, I loved his point of view on the world. He talked a lot about how Harry Potter was like gang world, and each of the different houses were different gangs. It was an interesting analogy that he brought to it, which was kind of funny.
So every time he watched Harry Potter with her, he was talking about how they were all gangs. What else did he say? Like they were different gangs. They had colors, right? Each house had different colors. They all fought each other. They were always fighting and killing and murdering. I thought that was funny that he, was watching Harry Potter with her. I, again, loved the characters so much. I think this would be a great book for the young adult in your life. And again, we want to promote always being exposed to any arts by people of all different, races, colors, all, as much diversity as you can bring into your life as possible, and not just to be exposing yourself to authors and artists who think and look like you.
Absolutely. Also for us to teach the younger generation how to continue to think about these things as well, in addition to ourselves, right?
Definitely. And I think as well, how do we want to make change? How can we respond when we see an injustice? And what that looks like for us to be an activist in our own life.
One of the quotes in the book is, you can destroy wood and brick, but you can't destroy a movement. And I thought that was a really profound thing to think about.
Absolutely.
So Jess, I don't know about you, but I really did like this book. I love the story. It's been on my queue of reading since it came out. I've heard great things about it. I haven't seen the movie yet. It's not an uplifting book, but it does end with a lot of hope. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm better for having read it. It certainly is one of those books that will stick with you.
Absolutely. It's a tough, gut-wrenching read, but you're right, ending on such notes of hope.
So if you haven't read it already, be sure to pick it up. The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas.
Thanks for listening and joining us today.
And don't forget to follow us on social media at Chasing Brighter or on our blog, chasingbrighter.com.